Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Daniel Birnbaum. I'm the Artistic Director of Acute Art, and it's my pleasure to introduce Michelle Kuo. Many of you, I think, know Michelle as the famous editor of Artforum magazine. You were the editor for a decade.
No, just 8 years.
Well, okay, 8 years, but almost a decade. And now you're the Marlene Hess Curator of Painting and Sculpture at MoMA. The reason why we do this, or the reasons, are several actually. Michelle is the leading expert in the world of a movement called EAT, Experiments in Art and Technology, and wrote a massive book that I've never seen because it's not printed yet.
Not published.
But I hear it's 1,000 pages thick, and it's actually a Harvard dissertation on EAT, and that's what you will talk about. But it's not only this historical EAT which happened in the 1960s. It's also an exhibition that just opened at the Museum of Modern Art, your first exhibition, which has a subtitle, Experiments in Art and Technology in the 21st Century. New Order, Art and Technology in the 21st Century. And it involves many artists who we're very interested in here at Acute, including Mark Leckey, with whom we had a conversation just very recently in this room, and Josh Klein and Annika Yee and other people who we're very interested in. Also, a third reason is that we did a little book together. So this is also a book launch, actually. We were both invited to talk, and I curated, is that the word, this conference in Switzerland, in a small village called Verbier. And it had the title, Art, well, More Than Real, Art in the Digital Age. And yeah, the book exists now. It's a small but dense book. Quite beautiful, designed by Irma Boom, and we might talk about that too. But what we will have here is a mixture of, a small mini conference that you can all participate in. But first, a presentation of EAT and also of your exhibition. A warm welcome to Michelle Kuo.
Thank you. I guess I'll just stand, which is perhaps better, but thank you so much, Daniel, for a very generous introduction, and to everyone at Acute Art for organizing this and hosting us this evening. So I thought I would give you a little bit of this prehistory of art in the digital age and of what is real and what is virtual or deemed as such, and then segue into just a little gloss on this small collection exhibition I've put together at MoMA that's up right now. But hopefully that will lead us into the contemporary ramifications of art and technology. So I'll just, normally I'm a very low tech person actually and show slides or a projection, but if you direct your attention to this screen, it will have some historical images. And I just want to gloss over a project that this group, Experiments in Art and Technology, produced in 1970, which you see here. So it looked like smoke and mirrors. The Pepsi Pavilion was a giant dome created for the World's Fair in Osaka in 1970. And it was shrouded in this kind of all-encompassing and ever-shifting fog, which you can just see misting here. Inside, one wandered inside a 90-foot diameter, 210-degree spherical mirror, 10 times larger than any spherical mirror ever built. And this is actually a prototype, but I just want to show you for the purposes of seeing what that dome really was like. More on that soon. The optical effects were unprecedented, reflections that were fully three-dimensional, inverted, and hovering in space, so literally upside down. You can get a glimpse of that in this very confusing image here. An elaborate, programmable electronic control system produced complex electric lights and sounds that took advantage of the equally wild acoustic properties of this spherical dome. Wireless radio handsets allowed visitors to pick up different audio transmissions as they walked around the space, And kinetic sculptures, lights, lasers, and performances animated the pavilion throughout. And you see the exterior here. Nothing could seem more spectacular, more exemplary of the global expansion of technology and of money. This was a large-scale international project which offered a vast arena of sensory experience, but also of communications media, blending the physical movement of bodies with pulsing transmissions, computation, and electronic systems. It was immersive. It went beyond. And the title of the pavilion was, fittingly, World Without Boundary. But the pavilion was not just a simple reflection of some utopian global village. It was not just another chapter in the story of culture subsumed into technology. The pavilion really goes against the usual oppositions that we draw between art and technology, between the simulated and the real, human and machine, that still usually characterize our conversations even today. The very making of the pavilion was a collective experiment. More than 75 artists, engineers, and architects you see lined up on the side of the pavilion here worked in collaboration or competition with both Japanese and American construction firms, Pepsi executives, and government bureaucrats from both countries. And on the right, you can see an engineer on the left and an artist on the right, dressed accordingly for the times. The artist Robert Breer, who you see in this colorful scarf, who is better known for his experimental animated films and kinetic sculptures, happened to live in an upper middle class town in upstate New York. And his neighbor happened to be a man named David Thomas, who was the vice president of the Pepsi Corporation. So Pepsi had already gotten a spot for a pavilion at the upcoming Expo 70. And the soft drink empire really wanted to make the most of it. The fair was buzzing with high-tech designs, and you can see the fairgrounds on the right. Groundbreaking Japanese architects designed many of these structures. It was the first Asian World's Fair and the largest World's Fair ever, and it was the first such event in Japan after the war. Needless to say, the horrific near past was sublimated in a display of nationalist, humanist, and techno-utopian pomp. Multinational corporations fit right into this endeavor. The president of PepsiCo Japan had launched the massive and massively successful, quote, Pepsi Generation ad campaign in 1963, basically inventing youth-oriented lifestyle marketing. And the pavilion was meant to extend this kind of futurist youth branding. So Thomas, the Pepsi executive, began to think that, quote, we would be very smart, instead of going the gimmick route like a rock concert, to do something genuinely prestigious, to create a piece of contemporary art, one very much in keeping with an avant-garde group, but one also understandable by the people in Japan, end quote. It's a little problematic statement. In September 1968, Thomas, the Pepsi executive, asked Breer, the artist, if he might be interested in participating. So he just approached his neighbor, basically. Breer at first said, no, I don't think so. But then he realized that he might just have the perfect solution. Breer had become involved with the organization Experiments in Art and Technology, or EAT for short, which Daniel mentioned. And this group had been founded in 1966 by the artists Robert Rauschenberg and Robert Whitman, and the Bell Laboratories engineers Billy Kluver and Fred Waldhauer. And you may have seen a little hint of this organization in the Rauschenberg show that was at Tate a few years ago. This group sought to facilitate collaborations between artists and engineers, sponsored by industry at a large scale. And by 1970, EAT boasted no less than 5,000 members around the world. And you see the first meeting here in a hotel room in New York in late 1966. These members would range eventually from core participants like John Cage and the artist Carolee Schneemann to sociologists like Daniel Bell and physicists like Vikram Sarabhai, who is head of the Indian Atomic Energy Commission. And nothing in the history of art really matches the scale of EAT. You see this germinal moment here, but it really ballooned. EAT, in other words, really formed an extraordinary parallel between art and the rise of what's been called big science, an explosion in the scale of scientific and technological laboratory research in the mid-20th century. And the Pepsi Pavilion was one of the largest single collaborations in post-war art. But not surprisingly, it was rather chaotic. The project's organizational structure constantly changed as it unfolded, but it began with a loose echo of the large-scale laboratory from which many of the participants and engineers came, Bell Labs. And you see a smattering of images from Bell Labs here. Billy Kluver and the majority of the engineers who came to work on the Pepsi Pavilion worked at Bell Labs. Others came from IBM, Toshiba, laser manufacturers, plastics companies. But what happened at Bell was a very particular and ultimately short-lived situation. It was really like no other laboratory or industrial research facility of the time. Within several decades, Bell had given rise to more Nobel Prizes, more inventions that shaped the whole of contemporary technology, from the transistor, which is the foundation of all digital computing hardware, to information theory, to the detection of the background radiation that proved the existence of the Big Bang. And Bell Labs has been the subject of a lot of study, but today I'll just highlight one main characteristic that was cited over and over by Kluver and the other engineers who pursued their whimsical sort of off-duty dabbling in art. They each stressed the fundamental open-endedness of the research, as opposed to the directed and instrumental research of previous eras of applied science. Quote, "An engineer who does not fail 96% of the time is not a good engineer," Kluver pronounced. And Kluver is in the upper right-hand side with a Jasper Johns painting for which he devised the neon letter R with a hidden battery. This is an anechoic chamber that was at Bell Labs. You see scientists working on the laser in the bottom left, and then this is the original Bell Labs structure in Murray Hill, New Jersey. It's kind of warren of buildings. So Breer, Kluver, and Rauschenberg all gathered a group of artists they felt would be interested, and you see some of them here, David Tudor and Fujiko Nakaya among them. This group won the contract from still dubious executives at Pepsi by the skin of their teeth. They were actually competing against groups like the Electric Circus and other kind of psychedelic groups. The fog was realized by this young Japanese artist, Fujiko Nakaya, who you see in the turtleneck here. And she devised, with an engineer named Tom Mee, a wholly new form, a pure water fog with no chemicals, basically an enormous atmospheric sculpture that had never been produced before. And the idea of a full hemispheric mirror dome was also a product of these group discussions. They were all interested in both the optical and acoustical properties of a dome. And the actual shape, material, and construction of the dome was the outcome of many trials and dead ends and forking paths. And Tudor, who's on the very left here, was an amazing electronic composer and sound artist who was really interested in the acoustical properties of the dome. Lots of research and testing ensued. A physicist at Caltech in California named Elsa Garmeyer led the effort. And after much exploration of a hard shell versus an inflatable structure, the group decided to attempt a full-scale prototype, which you see here, of an inflatable mirror dome with materials supplied by a top balloon technology firm and constructed with members of EAT's local branches in LA, in a Marine base in Santa Ana, California, and this is the base here. Even the Marines pitched in. A metallized plastic called Melanex that was 1/1000th of an inch thick formed the membrane and had to be cut in precise sections, fitted together with extreme accuracy, and then inflated to the exact point at which maximum surface tension was achieved for the best optical effects without bursting. Unfortunately, the prototype burst with a deafening explosion, and you see that here. It's kind of sad. Okay, so the group said, well, let's try and find another contractor, as anyone who's renovated an apartment who knows this dance well. And they found a contractor named G.T. Sheldahl, who had successfully built the most well-known inflatable spherical mirror to date, which you see here on the left, the first telecommunications satellites designed by NASA and launched between 1960 and 66. But while the satellites worked via their exterior mirrored surfaces, it was very dumb, actually. They're launched into space, and they reflected and transmitted radio waves that they would bounce it back to Earth as they orbited. The Pavilion dome, and you see an architectural diagram on the right, relied on the reflective properties of its interior surface, which was a totally untested scheme. A project engineer named Sigvar Stenlund, another Swede, who worked on both of the NASA satellites, actually became the lead engineer for the Pepsi Pavilion balloon, eventually developing a negative air pressure design, which you see on the right, so that the balloon was housed in a plywood shell. So when a vacuum was created between the two layers, the balloon's normal air pressure caused it to inflate. The fog was another extremely difficult and challenging proposition. The energy it would take to achieve the pressure necessary to create water droplets that were small enough to not simply condense and fall right away was enormous. You needed a lot of energy, and it was much more than you could really get at the expo site. The team ultimately created a system of tiny nozzles, 1/10,000th of an inch in diameter, which you see lining the pavilion here. These would spray the water droplets and break them up with the needed pressure to create a fog. And you see both Nakaya, Kluver, and an engineer working on this pumping system on the right. A full electronic control system was devised using tapes to program sound and lights throughout the pavilion, and also transistor radio broadcasts. So you see Tudor actually working on these with these magnetic tape reels, and then a massive nest of wires. And people, too, became effects. The pavilion produced perceiving subjects, multiple subject positions, and shifting experiences. The mirror dome was really like a machine for points of view, for encounters with reflection. But these were not ordinary reflections. Near holographic, three-dimensional inverted reflections, as you see here, had never been produced at this scale. They hovered in space above visitors' heads, and they could be perceived fully in the round, front, sides, and back, if you circled the image, complete with parallax and perspectival distortion. And this is part of actually a choreographed performance that you see here. In the language of optics, these were, quote, real images, images that are produced by the actual convergence of light rays. And this is another phantasmagoric image that helps you see a bit better. But basically, real images are distinguished from so-called virtual images, and these are the actual terms, which we see only because of the appearance of converging rays. So when we look in a flat mirror, which is what you basically see on the bottom, you see a virtual image, one that is right side up and that appears behind the mirror. That's very familiar to us. But the real images in the pavilion hung in front of the mirrored surface, and you see the diagram on the top, in the same space as the viewer. So rather than returning a body that was vertically oriented, commensurate with our own, the pavilion images were unbelievably palpable. They were marvelously illusionistic, but they were also inverted and unmoored, uncanny. In other words, these real images were not so real after all. And each individual view was unique and irreconcilable. Each person saw a reflection in a slightly different position. And you see some more crazy images here where people are taking advantage of the mirror with fabric, balloons, all sorts of performative events. There was a phenomenon called spherical aberration. The different parts of a spherical mirror reflect to different positions, generating many different focal points. So no two people can have exactly the same image world, as Garmeier, the physicist, put it. the dome was composed of, quote, an infinity of worlds. And light did not only reflect once, of course. Because light kept bouncing around the dome, the infinity of worlds dramatically multiplied again. The pavilion generated an exponential barrage of first order and second order and third order reflections and so on. And you see the multiple striations here as well as on these top two, or these two left images. So for example, if you were walking toward the mirror itself, away from the center of the dome, you'd see not only a real image or a virtual image, but its reflection and then its reflection in turn. Reflections of real images, of virtual images, and virtual images of real images. And on the top right, again, I don't know if you can see this small image, but basically you get a right side up because it's many times over. But something in the dead center of the pavilion, on the raised platform, which you see on the bottom right, would flood the entire dome with its image. So they put a red balloon here, and it filled the entire dome. So far from any kind of stable mimesis, this dizzying mirror descended into a vortex of magnification, distortion, and transience. And this is why I think that accounts of the mirror dome seem caught in a kind of endless confusion between the real and the virtual in the broader senses of the words. So on the one hand, a lot of people spoke of the experience as strikingly embodied, corporeal, and material. But others characterized it as, quote, elusive, non-real, immaterial, virtual, imagistic, the opposite of a real environment of real objects, end quote. And one critic wrote, quote, the differences between art and life, the real and the unreal, are being utterly and finally erased. The concept of reality is no longer relevant, end quote. This was not a conquest of the real, but an escape from the real. The mirror dome was really a form of simulacrum, to put it another way, a simulation without any referent, a copy without an original. And where the mirror pushed illusion over into simulation to a vertiginous loss of stable reference, the fog, which you see here, turned an ephemeral form into a resolutely physical, material experience. Fujiko Nakaya, the artist, said she did not want a wafting ether. She wanted the fog to really block you, to be tangible, quote, to feel soft and cool to the skin, a fog to walk in, to feel and smell, to disappear in, end quote. And the fog should also be vulnerable to atmospheric conditions, she said, making visible the otherwise invisible dynamics of the atmosphere, a, quote, negative sculpture of the environment, as she called it, and eliciting or bringing forth of the moisture already in the air. In practice, the fog was actually so thick when they turned it on, it drenched you, and you couldn't even see your hand in front of your face. And the first day, the expo authorities actually thought it was smoke, and they called the fire department, and so the trucks came screaming in. The pavilion becomes a profound exploration of the material and the immaterial, a network of technological tools and aesthetic objects and mutating subjects, all troubling the very notion of real and representation, of things and beings, of subjects and objects. And like a strange mirror of that telecom satellite, which you see on the left, the pavilion interior itself was filled with a wireless broadcast network of its own. And so the handset on the bottom right is being carried very charmingly by a young child, but you could carry this around and pick up different sound transmissions in the pavilion. And the project really reveals, I think, a fundamental anxiety about the loss of the subject position of us in the global network. It reveals a deep-seated anxiety about the loss of resemblance itself, the disappearance of tangible reality within the waves and networks of modern telecommunications. But the pavilion does not pose as salvation some kind of seamless global village or a utopian communications network. It also did not simply attempt a return to presence, to some stable real, lamenting the loss of authenticity or truth. Instead, the pavilion plunges into illusion and phantasmagoria, into another order of reality entirely. And we usually think about the virtual and the digital today in terms of representation, of trying to recreate the real, to make an experience that is as real as it can be. But maybe we should think about the digital in terms of reconfiguring reality itself, the possibility of new and different networks that might also remap relationships of power. Okay, so that's the historical portion of today. And this is one last parting shot. And then I thought I would just segue into a few remarks about this somewhat spontaneous collection exhibition that I just did at MoMA, which is on view now, that's called New Order, Art and Technology in the 21st Century. And in some ways, these are all collection works, so they're previously acquired by my colleagues at the museum, but most of them have never been shown before, and I found out there's a reason for that. They all entail interesting technologies, unorthodox materials, and often strange or untested systems. And it's not that I want or think that any of these artists can really take up that mantle of the gauntlet that I just threw down from this historical episode, but I think that they do represent an exploration of technology that is very much rooted in materials and the physical dimension of technology, to remind us that technology is not some seamless ether that is the cloud. We haven't evaporated into it yet. We're still very much rooted in an industrial infrastructure, and in some ways a pre-industrial infrastructure that must be contended with and must be confronted. So just to give you a few examples, and we can talk more about this in the conversation, one work that we're including is a piece by the artist Taube Auerbach that's titled Alter Engine from 2015. And what you see is essentially a tabletop, and on top are over 100 components that have all been 3D printed out of various kinds of plastic. And Auerbach, as you might know, is a young American artist who often works with different kinds of geometries. And in this case, she explored the helix, which for her has this quasi-mystical dimension. The helix is found throughout nature, from DNA to pineapples, as well as in mathematics. It's been fancied as a kind of psychedelic shape. There's a book called The Cosmic Serpent from the 60s that she riffs on in a lot of her work. But then the other part of this work is that it's a reference to an exploded diagram of an engine. So if you're familiar with this long kind of technical diagram where a mechanism is taken apart so you can see the order of assembly of its parts, a lot of people do this apparently with car engines and actually put them on blue moving blankets and upload them to YouTube, which I was not aware of. But she really pairs this extremely mystical kind of harmony of the spheres shape with the utmost rationality. And that tension is really beautiful here. The other part of this, which was an adventure, it's shown for the first time at MoMA, is that, of course, 3D printed materials are really made not to last. They're for rapid prototyping, other kinds of ephemeral purposes. And so we've had to contend with what happens when you need to reprint some of these components. The vendors are not going to be the same. The materials are actually changing quite constantly, even within 6 months. So even reprinting one of these things in the future and potentially, well, we had to contend with this already, but basically you will get a totally different surface, opacity, and even maybe shape. So the conservators at the museum have worked with Taube quite a bit to try and find out what parameters she's okay with, but of course, it's going to be a constantly changing exercise. This idea of what new kinds of geometries, what new kinds of materials are creating really unprecedented forms is at the core of this work. This is another piece that's earlier by the artist Seth Price from 2006, and Price has done a huge series in vacuum-formed plastic, and this is one example. It's a gold vacuum-formed mold of a bomber jacket, another military design made in 2006, as he proclaims here. And Price has really been fascinated by plastic as what he thinks of as the material of the post-war industrial miracle. So in the 50s and 60s, plastic was seen as this miraculous substance. It could do anything, it could be anything. And Price compares plastic to the imagination we have about digital manipulation, that it too can do anything, it can be anything. And so this seemed like a really wonderful marriage of these material histories and this speculation about digital futures. This is another work by a fellow Brit, Josephine Pride, and it's a photographic print that's from 2011 called It's Not My Body. And it's an inkjet print, but what you see here is actually a superimposition of an MRI scan of a fetus inside a woman, and it's laid over a very high-resolution kind of alien landscape of what seems to be a desert. And Pride has really talked about this image, which is part of a larger series, in terms of science fiction. And what struck me was really that an MRI, if any of you have had one, I recently had to have one for my knee, is basically a crazy experience. It's driven by extremely high intensity magnets. And this idea of conducting substances or conducting materials really runs as a thread throughout the show. And Pride speaks about this very eloquently. So another conducting substance, and this is an installation of this rather crazy show on the second floor, is this work you see in the middle, which is a series of 7 plexiglass vitrines with lights on them. They're faintly green, and they're by the artist Annika Yi. It's a work called Shameplex from 2015. And the vitrines are filled with a few inches of ultrasound gel, and then there are metal pins distributed throughout in different patterns into the gel. Again, this was never shown before, so we had to find the right gel, which actually corrodes the pins, because part of the work is that over the course of the show, the pins will rust and create these kind of blood red capillaries, which they're already doing. But again, this idea of ultrasound gel as a conducting medium, it literally allows a probe to image the interior tissue of a body with all of the kind of references that implies, was something that seemed very poetic and interesting to me. And just continuing the plastic motif in the background is this work by the artist Rodney Mcmillian. It's actually quite huge, but we hung it for the first time. It's called Succulent from 2014, and it's made out of vinyl, industrial grade vinyl, that's been sutured together in this bizarre organic / synthetic shape. And Mcmillian really talks about it as a black hole, as a portal to another world. And he's very interested in issues of futurism and Afrofuturism, which is to say, what other kinds of histories and even futures might we imagine, whether through different cultures or because of them. Back on that wall of red glass plates you see here with this very elaborate lighting rig is actually a series of holograms by the artist Louise Bourgeois. Again, a funny discovery in the collection of the museum that no one had really ever looked at, and she made them in 1998, but they were, because the medium was unstable, they were remade in 2014 as silver halide emulsion on glass. So there are 8 of these. And they're basically one-to-one representations of these small sculptures she made. They're about 10 by 12 inches. But they're incredibly, they are holograms. So if you stand in front of them, you have to light them with a special red light, which is that lighting rig we built. You will get a full holographic effect. And it's very uncanny. Again, for someone like Bourgeois, who is a surrealist artist par excellence, to make this connection between the real and the surreal was just a really fantastic discovery. This is just a quick install shot on the right, which is a bit foreshortened. You see an LED wall with a work by Ian Chang, who some of you may have seen from The Serpentine. That's a video work which, to make a long story short, is an AI-driven video game with no beginning or end, as he calls it, and it's essentially something that is unfolding in real time, that has no beginning or end, and it tells this kind of narrative of an artificial intelligence 3,000 years in the future who is exploring the landscape with a cadaver that he has resurrected of a human from the 21st century. So it's a pretty fantastical tale, but what's interesting to me is that, first of all, showing it on an LED wall in front of a window really does create this palpable experience of another kind of portal to another world. But also, Chang really explores the difference between, we often think of stories as human-driven by definition, but this is a story that's driven by a machine, and it's kind of about life after humans. On the left is this very funny work by the artist Josh Klein. It's essentially a refrigerator with an LED light box around it, and it's called Skittles from 2014. And this is a better image of it. So it's filled with 15 different flavors of smoothies, as he calls them. And what we acquired was basically this refrigerator with the light box, a sculpture. We inset it into the wall, and we acquired a bunch of the dry ingredients for these smoothies. So each one has a different set of flavors, and they're basically riffs on lifestyles and almost the engineering of the body. So on the bottom, the juice is called Big Data, and it's got ground up Google Glass bits in it, along with shredded Verizon bills, actually Klein's own, you can see his name in one of them, bacteria, omega-3 fish oil, Purell, and I guess shredded porn. And the top is a juice called Anarchy, and it's got vodka, protein powder, Axe body wash, self-tanner, etc. So Klein actually spent 5 days in our conservation lab with our sculpture conservator, who had the privilege of putting this work together for the first time, and he supplied the wet ingredients as well as the more hazard or illicit substances, and they blended these smoothies together in the conservation lab, which was a first for MoMA as well. But this idea of engineering of the body, of how we chemically alter our bodies to become faster or smarter or better, is really taken up as well in this set of works by the artist Sondra Perry. And you may have seen these at the Serpentine as well. They're part of a larger body of works that she has made that are essentially exercise machines that have been turned against themselves and turned against you. On the left is a rowing machine, and on the right is an exercise bicycle. And the rowing machine on the left, for example, this resistance mechanism has been filled with hair gel, making it very hard to use, very high resistance. And then the exercise bicycle, the pedals are backwards, the handlebars are on the side. It's very difficult to mount, which is a real challenge for our security guards. And each has video monitors on them playing works by the artist that reference, to varying degrees, the extraction of labor from bodies, the sort of blurring of lines between leisure, between working out and labor, working, and the history of basically labor and violence in the slave trade. So it's a whole gamut of references, but again, it really goes back to this question of the engineering of the body and the interaction with machines. And this is another work that really picks up on these themes as well by Trevor Paglen, and it's called It Began as a Military Experiment from 2017. And what you see here are photos of military employees that were part of just a database that were used for the development of the very first facial recognition algorithm in the US Department of Defense. And what you can't see here is that each image is very faintly overlaid with little tags or marks that essentially show you which facial characteristics, or show the machine which facial characteristics should be being compared and basically scored against one another. So eventually, when you have enough of this data, of these bodies, you will be able to learn. The network will be able to learn and learn better and recognize. And of course, this was in the 90s, this experiment at the US Department of Defense, but real functional facial recognition is only possible now with the advent of big data and with social media, where gargantuan amounts of data are being uploaded by us and tagged, and we're training those networks. And this is just a parting shot with, again, our plastic friend by Mcmillian. On the right is a video piece by the artist Tabor Roback, which is another animation. Like the Ian Chang piece, they're both programmed with a video game engine. So this is just a smattering of pieces that we brought together, but we could talk about this and all things technological and otherwise.
Yes, thank you so much. So your presentation really has two parts.
Thank you.
And in every conference or every article on art and technology, sooner or later this group EAT will be mentioned as a kind of important and also impressive moment. And I wanted to start with a few questions about that. I mean, your example is the maybe most visually sensational, I think, this Pepsi, at least one of them.
Yeah.
It was an attempt to bridge the gap between art and, in a way, industry, not only technology. And we're so used to artists being critical of many things, including technology and industry and commercial aspirations. And it's unusual that they seemed very kind of affirmative, basically. Maybe not entirely, but I mean, was it a kind of critical or post? I mean, how would you phrase that?
Well, I think they really grappled with precisely this question, which many art historians and critics and cultural critics would later, which is the impossibility of having any kind of outside critical position, or the loss of these stable binaries that were really held dear by modernism. So instead of saying that there is a place where you can stand outside of technology, for example, and say technology is bad, actually you're always implicated, right? And I think they understood that to a certain degree, and but the project comes out of recognizing that technology had run amok, that there were side effects that had become the main effects of technology, whether it was environmental disaster or military violence or the alienation of humans. They were grappling with this in the 60s and 70s. And so what they wanted to do was say, is there a way that we can intervene in the technology that is being created, normally by people and in places that we wouldn't really have access to, but can we get access to them, and can we change them from the inside? And there are parallels with Russian constructivism and productivism, because those people ended up wanting to go into the factories and really change even, organizational, like, workflow charts from the inside, which, again, they didn't really succeed in the way that they thought they did, or they would, but they nevertheless attempted to. And I think that's the part where they go beyond this yes or no, critical or affirmative kind of divide. The members of EAT were really speculative. They thought that they were confronting future scenarios that no one could place into a box neatly anyway, because we didn't know what those possibilities were.
I mean, one of the reasons why it's often mentioned is because there are many endeavors and many projects where one says that what happens if we introduce new tools to a group of artists who happen to be the most important artists, and that's an easy thing to say, but actually when we look at that group, it was the most important group of artists. I mean, it was John Cage, it was Robert Rauschenberg, it was even Warhol, I think.
Warhol,
and I mean, at least in an American context, it really was quite amazing. But, now, but I was thinking of what are other exceptions, because we are so used to the critique of technology as being at the center of cultural endeavors, also philosophical ones, from, say, the Frankfurt School all the way to Heidegger. It's always a critique of technology rather than a kind of embracement or affirmation. But I mean, there are other exceptions, such as, I mean, futurism. But that was a scary exception because they were actually very close to fascism and politically quite complicated. There's Zero, the group in Germany that was a little bit more affirmative when it comes to technology. And then there was this show at the Pompidou, curated by Jean-François Lyotard, called Les Immatériaux, the Immaterials, which has also been often discussed as a key example of, in the art world, where the attempt was to bridge the gap between the two cultures, the scientific and technological and the artistic.
Well, I think the thing about EAT is that it's not that they were embracing technology as it was, they were rejecting technology as it was and trying to create something new. What's interesting is that unlike Zero or even Les Immatériaux or the Futurists, they don't end up in traditional institutions like the academy or the museum. They're trying to create their own organization, and that becomes a whole other very interesting 5,000 member strong network around the world, which is its own
it's
story.
amazing that it became so big.
Yeah.
Because I always thought that it was Rauschenberg and Cage and a few engineers.
Yeah.
But it was 5,000, what did you say?
Members,
5,000 people.
at the peak.
And were they mainly engineers?
No, they were from all over. And again, the word member is used loosely in the sense that these are people who applied to be members. So you could fill out a membership form. And after a certain point in time, these membership forms became a very primitive type of punch card, because what they wanted to do eventually was they wanted to match artists and engineers. So if you were an artist who was interested in plastics or holography, which is literally the case with someone like Eva Hess, they would match you with an engineer whose specialty was plastics or holography or cybernetics or whatever. And they wanted to create essentially a matching system for this, which is what they did in a fledgling sense. But I guess, as one friend said to me, so all you're telling me is that EAT invented Match.com, which would be a sad way to think about it, but it was really a fledgling social network, for better or for worse.
Where I used to work at the museum in Stockholm, the Moderna Museet, we have some of the pieces from some of these events they did.
Yes.
Not the glamorous Pepsi Pavilion, but other maybe less kind of visually overwhelming things. And there was a thing called the nine evenings at the Armory in New York, which is also always mentioned as the kind of highlight of art and technology dialogues. But that was reviewed as very kind of disappointing, visually underwhelming.
Yeah.
And it's actually, something that often happens. Also this Les Immatériaux, the most, it had the biggest budget in the history of the Pompidou, I think, was also seen as something visually rather disappointing.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering a little bit, now that you're working with contemporary artists today, and I mean, a bit in relationship to what we are doing here at Acute, that the technologies today are visually so overwhelming, I have to say. Regardless if we like it as art or not, it is visually kind of, it's a knockout sometimes, VR things and AR things. And I mean, the things that you have been looking into, is the Pepsi Pavilion the only thing that was visually kind of grand?
No, and in many ways, part of what they were embracing, or they said they were embracing it even more after the fact, was failure. But this performance series that you mentioned, 9 Evenings, which took place at the Armory in New York in 1966, basically it was very interesting because honestly it was the first moment, it was the rise also of PR, which is a very weird moment in cultural history. So I think many of these artists were not interested in spectacle or this spectacular kind of event, but the performance actually kind of got billed as such. So even an ad for it would say, like, you will see bodies floating and brainwaves, coming alive or whatever. And then they got there and nothing worked, and there were these massive delays, and everyone was actually really angry. So there's this amazing anecdote from one of Yvonne Rayner's performances, actually, where the performer, who is a guy named Michael Kirby, said that the audience was so mad, and this was huge venue, there were thousands of people in the audience. They were so mad they were stamping their feet and basically yelling at the performers because nothing was happening. And he actually felt scared. So, there is this question of failure, and yet it's also in part really tied to the practice, because someone like Cage was all about essentially noise, about non-events, about non-spectacle, and many of you know that he created pieces that were literally just about sitting in a room with silence, or noise and yet silence. So this was a dialectic that was really embedded in their practice, and I think part of what happens today is that people still want spectacle, they want something that's very seductive, and they want to be wowed, but of course that's not what a lot of artists are interested in the end, at the end of the day.
I mean, in the end, many of the artists are interested in deconstructing or sabotaging the medium rather than kind of affirming it completely.
Yeah.
We're working with some artists who maybe are for most people, unlikely candidates of these new technologies, that we're producing a quite wonderful piece with Anthony Gormley, together with an astrophysicist friend of his. And it's going to be, a VR piece that is launched in a week, actually. And I don't know if people expected Anish Kapoor to do a VR piece, but I mean, he's such an important practitioner in another field. And when you were looking into the collection of MoMA, you found surprising things. I would say, I mean, I saw your show just a week ago, and that was fantastic to see these things, including Louise Bourgeois doing holograms. I really had never heard of that. Yeah. And were there other such kind of strange discoveries?
Yeah, like there was this funny little inkjet print that was a drawing by the artist Rosemary Trockle, and she had this series of things where she would make drawings, scan them, and they were often composites of different faces and figures, and then print them out, and they were digitally manipulated. So you get this kind of weird spectral face that's neither human nor animal, and that's another artist who actually has been thinking about technology for a long time, but we don't normally associate her work with that. And I think that's part of it, which is many of the most astute, I think, comments on a technological format or medium don't necessarily have to take place within that format or medium. So Ed Ruscha is an artist who commented really interestingly on information theory in a series of drawings. And that's something that I think you start to understand.
Sometimes when I talk about what we are doing and when I'm excited about it, people who want to be a little bit dismissive, they say that, yeah, that's a little bit like all those holograms that were made in the 90s or 80s or even 70s. And
60s,
and I've come across that, of course, that, do you think that's a risk?
Of course. And I mean, some of this is just pure kitsch, but I think part of what's interesting is that artists are like technologists. They're interested in experiment and not having a foregone conclusion when you start out with a project. So
actually, the favorite piece that is in your show, you didn't even show. My favorite, which is Mark Lecky's piece.
Oh, yes, sorry. I didn't have a good,
not only now Mark is not here, but he was here a few weeks ago when we had this conversation. And we are producing we're working on something. So he will actually move into VR. There isn't a virtual reality piece in your show. Will there be, or
we don't own one?
Yeah. So when will that happen?
So yes, well, when you donate a work, then we'll be able to show it.
Okay.
No, it was very interesting seeing what the museum does and does not have, and I think part of it is just. Well, with someone like Lecky, what was great about his work was really the piece that we show is Made in Heaven, which many of you will have seen, which is a 16mm film of a very strange scene. And it's basically a camera hovering around a room and then zooming in on what looks like Jeff Koons's stainless steel sculpture bunny. So you see this really weird reflection of the room in this steel sculpture. But then you realize that there's no camera person or camera, and that actually this is a totally virtual simulation. It's a CGI animation that Lecky has retroactively, or not retroactively, he's transferred it to 16mm. So it's a very strange, and actually the camera itself, even though this was made quite early on, it looks like a drone because it's hovering around. So it's a very strange, uncanny experience. But I hope that I hope that we may engage his VR work at the museum.
Let's hope.
Yes.
Yeah. Is there a kind of interest in? I mean, you just joined the Museum of Modern Art, so maybe it's strange for me to ask this, but is there interest in AR and VR and such technologies?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I can't speak for. So I'm in the Department of Painting and Sculpture, which is another sort of funny thing, and my colleagues in the Department of Media and Performance Art are definitely interested in this, as am I. And I think part of what was interesting about this show is that we might have a work like Josh Klein's Smoothies, where it's the sculpture conservator that's responsible for it. Or we had another work that I didn't show that's by the artist Sam LeWitt, which is essentially an etched copper-clad circuit board. He basically used the substrate that's normally we make copper circuit boards out of, but he did his own thing with it. And that's in the Department of Prints and Drawings, but then the sculpture conservator also worked on it. So it created these interesting bedfellows, even in a institution like MoMA, and I think people are interested in that crossover for sure. So VR, AR, when the time comes, when the right piece comes along, I'm sure.
I hope it will come soon. But because, I have to say, with all due respect to MoMA, which is the most important collection of Western modern art in the world, your show was surprisingly kind of cutting edge.
That's, I'll take that praise, and,
Yeah.
But I think it was really, again, also an experiment. It was really fascinating to see what was there, and also quite an adventure to put these things on display. But they were acquired by my colleagues, in the last 5 or 6 or 10 years, and
you make them visible now.
And
yeah,
it's really great.
Maybe a quick remark about the little book that we did together, which is, has essays about many things, not only VR and AR, basically about this dialogue between art and technology. And in my little preface, I have this hobby philosophical theory that some artists are anticipating this possibility, that it's called premonitions. So it's like that all the immersive tendencies in everything from James Turrell to Philippe Pareno at the Turbine Hall wants to be VR, basically.
Yeah.
Tries to be VR,
yeah.
and is maybe VR intellectually.
Yeah.
And what do you think? What will these, when these technologies become a little bit more mainstream in exhibitions and institutions and for artists? I think we can all have a sense of what might. We're already aware of artworks, but institutionally, will it change things? Will it change the idea of an exhibition? Will it change the idea of a museum?
Yeah, I think, I hope so. I think that all of our ways of experiencing perception in general are changing, and that will inevitably change the museum experience too. So already the fact that you have this series of blended juices as well as a video game engine developed piece, those are all new, or in some ways new, and I think, the museum is responsible in a way has a responsibility for trying to contend with these new formats and media, so.
I'm thinking a little bit about a world that I know maybe even closer than you do, namely the kind of biennial, triennial kind of world that, I spent a decade trying to, form a bit, and that, this whole world of traveling exhibitions and the people going across. Actually, I got at least 10 emails today from people who were so sorry that they miss your presence here, but they're all in Hong Kong. Yeah. Because, the art world travels, and all galleries, including every gallery assistant in this city, I'm exaggerating, but they all go across for 4 days, which seems a little bit maybe not entirely sustainable in the long run. Do you think that do you think these technologies can actually, I'm just fantasizing, but could one do shows in VR that actually happen in several cities at the same time? And I've just been, thinking.
Yeah, and I'm sure, some artists will think of really interesting ways, to do that. We already live in, I think as you just said a few minutes ago, a half virtual, half sort of real world anyway. Everything we exist in is augmented by our phones and our screens and different kinds of apparatuses. So, to try and do exhibitions in this kind of hybrid mode is surely a step away. Whether you want that to be part of the circuit of fairs and biennials, et cetera, is another story. But yeah, the dispersal of experience will always be, I think something that artists are interested in. So
maybe there are comments or questions in the audience. Feel free. There's a question here.
Oh, well, that's a funny story too. So it opened with the fanfare of the opening of the expo, and basically, to make a long story short, there was let's say, emerging conflict between Pepsi and EAT. Basically, EAT blew through the budget in some ways. Pepsi and EAT were not happy with each other, and eventually the Pepsi terminated the contract, so they kicked EAT out of the pavilion about a month and a half later. And David Tudor has these great stories of like smuggling out their tapes of their programming. And so, speaking of non-spectacle, in the Dome, they had been playing these very abstract sound pieces by Cage and Tudor and others. And Pepsi, after they kicked EAT out, replaced those sounds with "It's a Small World." So that's kind of a denouement, if you will, to the story. It doesn't exist. And there have been some efforts or interest in recreating it, but it's a very big. I mean, other elements exist, like some of the programming exists as files or whatever, but the Dome itself is no longer.
There's a comment here.
Thanks so much. That was a really fascinating presentation. I actually wanted to return a little bit to Daniel's first question. I wonder, are we letting EAT off the hook a little bit by saying, oh, well, they were engaging with technology, but trying to intervene and bring it in new directions? And I'm thinking particularly of the kind of military connections of these technologies. We just had the anniversary of the Cybernetic Serendipity show, which was at the ICA, Jassia Reichardt's exhibition. And the artist Gustav Metzger wrote a pretty scathing review of it at the time, the auto-destructive artist, and he was actually very involved with the computer art community in the UK, sort of stuck around as a bit of a kind of irritant in some ways and said, you know, come on guys, we need to think about where these technologies are coming from and what they were created for, which are usually military applications. And of course Bell Labs had a very close connection to that. So I'm just wondering, are there similar figures within EAT that were sort of more ethical qualms, I suppose?
I mean, all of them, in the sense that, I mean, Metzger was even a member of EAT, for example, as was Reichardt. So there were a lot of communications there. But more broadly, yes, you know, this is a huge history, and one part of that is that the group came under terrific fire by many of their peers who accused them of basically killing babies, like being complicit with Vietnam. And Max Kozloff wrote perhaps an analogous scathing review. Or just, it was called I think it was called the $1 Million Boondoggle, but basically accusing them of the same thing. And so they had to grapple with this. I mean, artists like Rauschenberg, like Cage, they were incredibly radical and leftist, and they, I think, again, for them, they were searching of some way forward that was neither affirmative nor a form of negation. And this was something, it was truly an experiment. But yes, they were very internally conflicted, and in fact, that's part of the history of the group too, is conflicts like with Pepsi. So for example, it matters that the end of the Pepsi story is not just a happy union between a huge corporation and this group, it was actually a dissensus and discord, and that happened actually throughout the entire existence of the group, which in the end, you know, petered out, in part, I think, because of these internal conflicts. So, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I actually own an industrial biotech startup, but I worked in the art world for like 20 years before that. And I have to say that my experience, I run a team of chemical engineers out of the University of Bath. And I often engage in conversations with people who work in very large international corporations. And I also have on my team people who worked for really big corporations like Visa, for example. And it's been my experience that actually the most cutting edge thinking about new technologies is coming from the corporate sphere. So for example, today I was asked to apply you know, to do a partnership with this French energy firm. And one of the questions that they had asked me is whether or not my company would establish digital dominance, a form of digital dominance. So, you know, obviously my company isn't working in that area at all. I'm working in chemical engineering, so I said no. But I had to Google digital dominance. And the remark that you made about power and telecommunications kind of struck a chord with me because I was just investigating that today. But I guess my question for you is, because it's been my experience that so many researchers and so much capital is being directed towards really cutting edge thinking within the corporate environment, whether or not you would ever consider working in a corporate partnership with a company that's really sort of forging new directions and sort of pushing boundaries in VR.
I mean, in principle, yes, I would be interested. I mean, for almost a decade, or actually, yeah, almost a decade, I ran a museum where we tried to find support to do things that weren't possible, and we were always looking for these kinds of things, and it happened to be Sweden, which is a very, very technically advanced country, actually, where with big corporations like Spotify and Skype, and they're the most impressive, maybe relatively new companies in this little town where I worked. So we tried to do these things, and we did on a small scale, but we never went all the way and found, like, actually, had I managed, I would have done it, but I simply didn't find the right combination, so to say. And it's interesting what you say, because maybe we have a kind of slightly romantic idea that the greatest ideas will come from artists when they get these tools, but maybe the great ideas also come from other places. And I think that was part of not only EAT, there was a similar thing in what was it called in Los Angeles?
Well, it was an exhibition called Art and Technology that they paired artists with
it was also this matchmaking thing, no?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But with the end goal of having this exhibition in the museum at LACMA. But yeah, it also created very strange bedfellows. But I think part of the romance in the 60s was people genuinely, like, people often ask, well, what was in it for the engineers? Why did they participate? And I think, there was this fantasy on the corporate side that artists would help the engineers think outside the box.
I don't think it's a fantasy. I actually think that it happens that way. And that there was some genuine value
totally.
Pepsi
or whatever corporation.
Yeah. I actually think that that's reality. That actually corporations do seek out creative thinkers. Maybe they don't necessarily have the freedom to operate in ways that they might like as subjective individuals, but nonetheless, corporations benefit, I think, enormously from these kinds of collaborations.
I think that's what they really hoped, and I think it's just a question of...
But Pepsi regretted the whole thing.
Yeah, they would rather have not.
But I think that they probably generated some...
Well, there's a really, again, historically speaking, it was interesting because there's a book by this guy named Fred Turner that's called From Counterculture to Cyberculture, which is basically about how the ethos of the counterculture was essentially subsumed into Silicon Valley, which is literally all about thinking different. So whether that's a happy ending or a sort of dystopian ending is up for grabs, but it is, there clearly was this convergence in some ways. On the flip side, I think, again, what happens with, I mean, these are great questions because there's still a relatively large disconnect between the highest echelons of super advanced research in technology and science and, let's say, the average person on the street. So the question is are there ways to bridge that gap, and is that, beneficial?
Alexa bridges that gap.
All right, I'll have to start using Alexa a little bit more. Yeah, but really changing, like, the development of something like Alexa in the first place. Yeah.
That's a good question. How do you go about doing that? Would you want to do that? What's the point of that? But I mean, I think GDPR and things like that. I mean, there's legislation which is now uncovering ways in which, people are being manipulated. And I actually have a colleague at the University of Oxford who's, writing legislation about ways in which AI is being programmed in biased and discriminatory ways. Yeah. Inadvertently.
Yeah. Trevor Paglin actually has been working on this too.
Yeah.
Oh no, I think it's just for question and answer.
Yeah. I mean, you looked at some of the things that Acute has produced, a remark by Anish Kapoor in the Financial Times now appears in my head. It had to do with the fact that these new technologies may be a little bit, that would put them apart a little bit from older possibilities, that they're visually so strong that, that VR can, there's no way, I mentioned this before, that they're simply overwhelming in a way. And he says that it's a dangerous medium because it's, it can be sensational, or it is almost automatically sensational if you use it in the right way. But he wonders whether whether he will end up doing sublime things or kitsch. that it's like so close in this medium. Is this something that you've thought about in relationship to these new, I mean, that it's...
Yes, for sure. And yeah, I think, you know, but it's just like with any medium. You can make a bad painting too, so.
Yeah. I mean, somehow Salvador Dali, who I think should have done VR had he been alive.
Yes.
I mean, he was pretty good at, you know, he was good at both, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's really about, as I think you're interested in as well, trying to find new ways of navigating what are essentially unprecedented experiences. Like, these are new experiences. So, you know, I think certain people are really interested in saying, okay, well, we're not going to take this as given. We're going to do something with it and maybe change it in the process. So
if EAT was, you know, still active, you think they would have probably been involved with AR and VR, no?
Yes, I'm sure. I don't know what if anything interesting would have come out of it, but I do think so for sure. And I think that's part of it, which is there's often also a knee-jerk reaction in the other way, which is that, oh, I'm not going to deal with anything that's high-tech or large-scale or whatever, because that would just be corrupt or spectacular. But like, if artists don't do it, then who will? Do you know what I mean? Like, why would we leave that ambition in the hands of a very few? So.
No, I have to say that among museum colleagues and people who I've been close to, the interest in this group that you have been researching is very strong. And I've always been a little bit, you know, I've also been interested in it, of course, but I always thought that it's not a good thing to become just nostalgic about things. I mean, John Cage did great things, 1966. We know that. But if that aspiration is still alive, we have to look at the possibilities today.
Yeah.
I'm so thankful that you came, because with this, the fact that you were here with us, it gives our endeavor a little bit of a historical context. And you are not only nostalgic, or you're not even at all nostalgic, you're both. You're interested in these things from an intellectual point of view, but also in very new art. So I'm happy that you're close to us, and I hope we can continue this dialogue in many, many other contexts.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle.
Thank you, Daniel.